Hi, I'm Andy. Welcome to narcolepsypumpkin.com. If you haven't done already, click on subscribe, click on the bell. That way you get notifications about new videos when they come out. So far in this series, we've looked at the single responsibility principle, the open-close principle, and in the last episode, we looked at Liskow's substitution principle and how those can apply to your coding standards and you, your team, and sometimes beyond. The astute among you might have realised that I've done these out of order, but only out of order in terms of spelling the word solid. There is no actual order to the solid principles. The only reason they're in the order of solid is to spell the word solid. The principles themselves are completely agnostic to the order in which they are looked at, viewed, applied. Episode 4, Dependency Inversion principle. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Dependency Inversion principle and how that can apply to you, your team, and potentially beyond. Now, I've found that Dependency Inversion principle is one of the harder ones to explain and seems to be one of the harder ones for some developers to get their head round. What we're looking to do is invert the source code dependencies against the runtime flow of control. What that basically means is we're looking to decouple our software. And we do that by depending on abstractions as opposed to concretions. And that is the essence of the dependency inversion principle, i.e. we are going to depend on things that are abstract, things that are not set in stone, over depending on things that are absolute concrete knowns. So we should be able to depend on abstractions instead of depending on concrete implementations within our code. This gives us something that's completely decoupled and allows those dependencies to be injected at runtime. So I think the reason why people have a difficulty grasping the dependency inversion principle, it's not that it's a particularly difficult concept, it's just that in real life we don't depend on abstractions. We only ever depend on things that are physical, i.e. we don't have an abstract pavement we walk on, we have an actual pavement we walk on. Now if we look at dependency inversion and its relationship to source code, it's very similar to man's relationship with nature. And it goes against a lot of what you learn about software development, certainly in the early days. So most developers' journeys will start with code that is largely monolithic and largely coupled. And if we look at early man and how they started out depending on nature, nature will provide is the original ethos of man. We've now realised that we need to manage our dependencies on nature, i.e. we need to actually manage nature to make sure it is sustainable, because depending on something that's finite really doesn't have a future. Now, generally speaking, software, if you continue with a coupled monolith, as complexity increases in your software, that becomes a kind of tangled mess. nature, if we're looking after a woodland, we don't cut all the trees down first and then replant it. We cut down some of the trees, but only after we have replanted enough forest to cover it. Looking after the woodland in kind of sections, so they're decoupled and we can maintain small parts of it and transition small parts of it from one state to another. That's how you have a sustainable forest. We need to do the same thing with software. So we cut it up into bits, i.e. decouple it. It allows us to maintain new bits and transition old bits without having to do the whole thing at once, and should be able to be tested, maintained and changed independently of anything else. This also means that it can be deployed independently of anything else. That brings a great power and flexibility to how we push our applications into a live environment. With a monolith, pushing the whole thing every time you make a change is quite a large overhead, and that drives us towards infrequent large deployments where we do lots of change and deploy the whole application as one on a very infrequent basis, meaning the risk after deploying that is huge. Whereas if we have a decoupled application, we can deploy elements of it independently of the rest of the application. That means we don't have to do huge deployments. It also means that our iterations can be small, the changes can be small, and they'll be pushed more frequently into a production environment. The goal that some companies have achieved with this is deploying multiple times a day. So dependency inversion and how that can apply to you. So how could this apply to you? Well, obviously you're not going to depend on abstractions. That would be absurd. You should look to provide an autonomous, valuable resource to other people and not the other way around. By that I mean you're able to work things out for yourself. You become an almost autonomous resource for other people to depend on, as opposed to somebody who constantly depends on other people for input in order to do or achieve anything. You should strive to be as little work for your manager as possible. You can go a step further and actually start to decouple yourself by teaching other people the things that you know or how to do things you've discovered. So pass on that knowledge. This is something we've already touched on in the previous episode, episode 3. You should try and make everybody know everything that you know. That way you can eventually leave your job behind and move on. And by doing that decoupling, you're actually meaning that the entire failure of something or the entire success of something is not solely resting on your shoulders. You should not make yourself a single point of failure. Anybody who's read the Phoenix Project, you need to make sure that you don't become Brent. When it comes to the wider organisation, dependency inversion can be looked at as deciding what you want to build and what you want to buy. If something is so important and so intrinsic to your business, don't abdicate that to somebody else. Don't be dependent on another company to provide you that service. If it's so important, do it yourself and do it internally. That way you'll have something that you can change to do what you want, will change with your business, and will absolutely do what you need it to. And there are some little exceptions to that, and that's where something is so complex or niche that it cannot be done internally. It is not economical to do so, i.e. something that a company's basically built their own business around that single niche, therefore they're providing a service that nobody else can. Trying to replicate that or build that internally makes no sense. If it does what you need it to do and the cost of building it internally is not economical, then your hand is forced and you should really go and look at the external thing to provide you that service. Today, a lot of modern organisations depend quite heavily on external digital agencies to provide development resource for things that are genuinely required for their day-to-day business. In my opinion, this is largely flawed. If you don't have the resource in your company to build something, you won't have the resource to maintain it. Maintaining software is almost, and sometimes more effort than actually writing it in the first place. Meaning that outsourcing that to a digital agency for the upfront build of that product means that you're either going to pull it in-house and allow it to rot and degrade because you're not maintaining it, or the team that it is handed over to isn't sufficient in size and resource to actually maintain that application properly, i.e. keep it up to date and add features. Keeping it clean and working is a lot of work and should not be underestimated. So we've looked at dependency inversion, we've looked at how that applies to code. Not actually so much in the way of the principle itself, but how that can aid with decoupling code and why that's actually important. I'd use a bit of an analogy with sustainable forest to try and see that we should be making code itself sustainable. We've also looked a little bit at how you can make yourself useful and depend on less people, i.e. make yourself a valuable resource to other people and not just somebody who sits there and waits for other people to tell them what to do. And a little bit about how companies tend to depend on digital agencies and how that might actually be flawed. Next time we're going to be looking at the interface segregation principle, and that'll be episode number 5.